Hi, I'm Rachel. Welcome to my channel, La Bricoleuse. This video documents the reproduction of a 1935 evening gown made of bias-cut, hand-painted silk, originally designed by the famous couturière Elsa Schiaparelli. A few years ago, the theater I worked for produced the 1930 Noel Coward play Private Lives. If you're unfamiliar with the script, it's basically about the honeymoon hijinks of bitchy rich white people. As a costumer and a huge fan of 1930s fashions, the clothes were the most exciting thing about the show for me. The costume team made 5 bespoke dresses for that production, but by far the most technically complex was the Schiaparelli replica. I was responsible for reproducing the intricate surface design of the original, a border motif of white calla lilies and other foliage painted on 4-ply silk. I had to work closely with the costume designer, Jen Caprio, and the draper, Leah Pells, to plan the order of operations so that the painted fabric was ready to be cut out and sewn into the gown in time for opening night. The first step in painting the silk required a bit of digital magic to prepare the calla lily artwork itself for the process.
Here's the costume rendering by designer Jen Caprio. And here's an image of the 1935 gown designed by Elsa Schiaparelli that inspired Jen Caprio's design. In Photoshop, I isolated one repeat of the motif in the photograph of the original dress and used the skew transform option to effectively reblock the fabric. I created a template from this corrected image to use as a guide in painting the calla lily motif down the length of the 4-ply silk we would use in creating our replica gown. The color palette of the costume design was very important, so I made this reference guide of the silk paints we would use. In the serti technique, Gutta resist is applied to the white parts of the design, and when it dries, it prevents the silk paints from bonding with the fibers in those areas. We created several samples to test the efficacy of this process. My assistant and I stretched every sample on a frame and traced the lily motif from our template using a washable pencil. Using an image of the original dress as a reference for the thickness of the lines, we applied the resist to each of the samples. Once the gutta had completely dried, we carefully applied the silk paints around the resisted motifs. These silk paints need to be steam set, and then the gutta resist must be removed in the dry cleaning process so as not to affect the drapey hand of the silk fabric. While my assistant and I were working on the surface design samples, the gown's draper, Leah Pells, was determining the pattern for the dress, creating a mock-up, fitting it on the performer, and then adjusting that pattern so that we would know the pattern piece shapes we would need to paint. A patron had recently donated boxes of these surplus muslin bandages left over after World War II. These were perfect to stitch along the selvages and the cut ends of the yardage that we needed to stretch on the frame and paint without stapling through the silk we'd make the dress from. After thread marking the pattern pieces on the fabric, but before stretching it on the frame, my assistant, Katie Keener, carefully traced the lily motif from our reblocked template onto the 4-ply silk. Here, the material that eventually became the dress is shown fully stretched on the paint frame. The entire resisted motif has been applied and dried, and we've just painted the tiny dots of rust and gold at the centers of the lilies. Thanks to all of our samples and preparations, the painting itself only took a 4-hour afternoon shift. Notice how we're applying water to the textile before the blue pigmented paint. That creates a sort of watercolor appearance that doesn't show up fully until after the paint has been steam set and the fabric washed and dried. Here's the finished textile design, ready to steam set the color. This was a perfect opportunity to use our yardage steamer. Because the color can migrate in the steam setting process, we created a kind of fabric jelly roll to protect our work, consisting of a layer of muslin, a layer of newsprint, the painted fabric, another layer of newsprint, and another layer of muslin, all rolled gently on a tube and then placed inside the yardage steamer. After the steam setting process, the fabric was laundered to remove any excess colorant and then dry cleaned to remove the gutta resist. There was one more step to the process, though, before the fabric could be cut and sewn. With the original motif as a reference, we used permanent textile markers to draw fine lines indicating the lily's petals and leaves. Here's a detail shot of the finished fabric ready to be cut and sewn into the beautiful Schiaparelli replica gown. This costume was custom made to fit equity actor Julie Fischel. After the show closed, it became part of a teaching collection of antique and contemporary bias-cut gowns. After these credits, you'll see an image of the dress on display alongside a replica of a Charles James design as part of a workshop on bias-cut gown construction.